So every year, the Indian budget drops, and it's a really big deal, right? It's basically the financial roadmap for the entire country. It's our one big chance to see, where our tax money is actually going. And let me tell you, this year, the promises, they were huge. I mean, listening to the budget speech, it was electrifying. It really painted this picture of a nation that's just on the brink of this massive transformation. We're talking about a semiconductor mission 2.0, 7 high-speed rail corridors. They even mentioned content creator labs in schools. It was this super ambitious list, and one analyst even said it felt like India was going to become a developed nation in just a couple of days. That's the kind of vibe it had.
But, and you know there's always a but, big promises are one thing, aren't they? The real story of any budget is always hidden in the numbers. And when you actually dig past those shiny headlines and get into the nitty-gritty, the financial data, a pretty clear pattern starts to emerge. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack right now.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First up, we'll look at this whole headlines versus the numbers thing. Then we'll get into what it means for your wallet and the nation's purse. After that, we'll ask, are we really building a developed India? We'll also tackle the big questions around jobs and farmers. And finally, we'll see how we're stacking up against major global headwinds.
All right, first up, headlines versus the numbers. So what is this pattern I keep talking about? Well, it's something you see time and time again. You get these really grand, exciting announcements in the speech, but then you look at the actual money allocated, and the story it tells is, well, a lot more quiet. Let's see exactly how this plays out.
Okay, let's dive into our first big area, your wallet, the nation's purse. And we have to start with the middle-class taxpayer, right? Because at the end of the day, it's our money that fuels this whole thing. So what did this budget really have in store for us? Well, the simple answer is not a whole lot, to be honest. If you were hoping for some direct relief, you didn't get it. No changes to the tax slabs, no changes to the tax rates. What we did get were some things for, quote, ease of compliance. Basically, making the paperwork a bit easier, like extending deadlines or decriminalizing some minor stuff. So yeah, simpler processes maybe, but definitely no extra cash in your pocket. So let's follow the money. Where does it all come from? Well, take a look at this. The single biggest chunk at 24% is just borrowing. That's right, almost a quarter of the entire budget is funded by loans. After that, it's us, the individual taxpayers. You combine the 21% from income tax and the 15% from GST, and individuals are kicking in a whopping 36% of the total revenue. That's literally double the 18% that comes from corporate tax. Kind of puts things in perspective, doesn't it? And on the flip side, where does all that money go? A big slice, around 22%, goes to the states. That's pretty standard. But here's the kicker. Look at the second biggest expense, 20%. Just on interest payments. Think about that. 1/5 of the entire budget, 1 out of every 5 rupees, is gone before we even start. It's just paying the interest on old loans before a single new school, road, or hospital gets funded. And this isn't a new thing. This chart here shows a really significant shift over time. If you look back, corporate tax used to be a much bigger contributor to the pot. But over the years, that burden has been slowly and steadily shifting onto individuals. The share paid by corporations has been trending down, while the share paid by you and me, well, that's been going up. Okay, so keeping that whole financial picture in mind, let's move on. Let's talk about building that developed India we heard so much about. To do that, you need to invest in key areas, right? Education, health, infrastructure. The big question is, does the funding actually match the ambition? I mean, on the surface, the announcements for education sounded absolutely amazing. We're talking 5 new university townships, girls' hostels for STEM students in every district, a brand new National Institute of Design, and get this, content creator labs in over 15,000 schools and colleges. These are seriously exciting, forward-thinking ideas. But here come the numbers again. For decades, all the experts, all the commissions, even the government's own new education policy have been saying the same thing. We need to spend 6% of our GDP on education. And the reality? We're still spending less than 3%. We're not even halfway there. And the sources we looked at argue this is the real reason for those insanely competitive exams and the crazy scramble for college seats. It's not about overpopulation, it's a chronic lack of investment.
And you know what? We see a very similar story playing out in healthcare. The budget promised some great things, upgrading institutions, training 150,000 new caregivers, even setting up 5 regional hubs to attract medical tourism. Again,
All really positive, ambitious goals you want to hear. But when you look at the spending, yep, the pattern repeats. The World Health Organization recommends that countries spend about 5% of their GDP on health. In India, we're still stuck at around 2%. So you get the big headlines, but the core funding needed to build a really strong public health system, it's just not there. It's way below what the experts say is needed.
Now, for urban development, the pattern actually flips on its head, and not in a good way. With all the talk about high-speed rail and smart cities, you'd expect a big boost, right? Well, the actual budget for urban development has been cut by 11.6%. And we're talking about the money for really core city issues here: water, sanitation, public transport.
And let me give you an even more specific and kind of shocking example. Let's talk about pollution control. In the last fiscal year, the government allocated over 8.5 billion rupees to fight pollution, which, as we all know, is a massive problem in our cities.
Okay, 8.5 billion rupees. Sounds like a good amount of money, right? But the key question is always about the follow-through. How much of that money that was set aside was actually spent? How much of it made it to the ground?
Get ready for this. Of that 8.58 billion rupees, only 160 million were spent. Let me say that again, 160 million. That is less than 2%. Less than 2%. And this kind of underspending has real direct consequences. It means worse air, worse water, affecting millions of people. It shows that even when the money is on the books, there can be this massive gap in actually using it, which, as the source material suggests, might point to a lack of real intention.
All right, let's shift gears now to two areas that are just absolutely critical for the majority of Indians: jobs for our youth and the state of agriculture for our farmers. How did the budget tackle these massive issues?
When it comes to unemployment, the strategy in the budget is, well, it's mostly indirect. It's focused on long-term stuff like schemes for sectors like textiles and MSMEs, the small and medium businesses that are really the backbone of our economy. And it's about setting up committees to study the problem. Now look, that stuff is important. But what the sources pointed out is what's missing: any kind of direct, large-scale job program. There are no concrete targets for job creation. And for the millions of young people looking for work right now, this long-term approach, it might just not be enough.
And then there's agriculture, which more than half our population depends on. Here, the sources highlighted what they saw as a really glaring omission, and this quote really sums it up. Now, sure, there were some announcements for niche things like fisheries, but the core issues, the things that affect the vast majority of farmers, we're talking about minimum support prices, the rising cost of fertilizer, access to loans, these things were pretty much absent from the main speech. And these aren't small details. They're the absolute fundamentals for hundreds of millions of people.
Okay, for our final section, let's zoom out a bit. We live in a world with some serious global headwinds, right? Trade disruptions, the absolute explosion of AI. How does this budget get India ready to face all that? The whole approach to AI it's a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, you have some positive mentions, like using AI for governance. That's great. But then you see there's no major dedicated funding for AI development. And then there's this big move: a 20-year tax holiday for foreign companies to set up data centers here. The problem? Those data centers use an insane amount of energy and water, which raises some really serious questions about our resources. And maybe the biggest thing, AI is projected to disrupt over 300 million jobs globally. And in this budget, there's no clear plan, no roadmap for how we're going to deal with that massive shift. And so that brings us right back to where we started, to that central question. Across education, healthcare, jobs, we've seen this pattern play out again and again. You get these really inspiring, powerful words in the speech, but they're followed by numbers that tell a much more modest story. It leaves us with a really critical thought, one we should probably apply to this budget and really any budget we look at in the future. When it all comes down to it, for the future of the nation, which one speaks louder, the words or the numbers?